Is it time to dismantle some doctrines? If you don't know what that means, then come along with me. I'm Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Bible college teacher and pastor of more than 20 years. Join me as we deconstruct whatever dogmas and beliefs have held you behind, and together work to reconstruct and rebuild your authentic self. I'm super happy to welcome back returning guest, Cait West. Welcome, Cait, to the Dismantling Doctrine podcast.
Yeah, it's so good to be back.
We were just saying before we hit record, we were trying to think when the last time we did an episode, probably 2 years ago, I think. And it seems like it was a long time ago. How come it's been so long since we haven't reconnected? I don't know. I don't understand that.
I don't know. I think just life gets in the way and then you forget how much time has passed.
Yeah, it's true. So you've come out with a book in the meantime. It's called Rift. And I've heard it's done really well, talking about breaking away from Christian patriarchy, and I'm sure we definitely want to get into that. But you were also on recently a documentary that came out called For Our Daughters, and that was by another former guest, Kristen Cobes-DeMay. So you've been really busy in the last year or so.
Yeah. It's been a crazy couple years. So I was interviewed for this documentary about a year and a half ago, actually. And so I wasn't sure when it was going to come out. And they decided to release the short version of it before the election, which I'm really happy they did. Because I believe they're working on a larger project based on Kristen's book, but they wanted to release this part about the survivor stories before the 2024 election.
Yeah. So is there going to be like a fuller version in that version? Are you going to be able to tell more of your story? Because I just actually watched it just now before I rewatched it again. And I thought, okay, there's a lot. You're in the beginning part of the documentary, but then you kind of disappear. Do you get to tell more of your story in the larger version, the fuller version?
I don't know. I'm not part of the whole editing process. I was just interviewed and I was there for a long time. So
Hmm.
I'm sure they have several hours worth of the interview that they could use. I think they wanted to use part of my interview to set up the framing of this shorter version, which I think they did really well. And I'm really happy that they focused on Tiffany and Jules and Krista's stories. I think they deserve the spotlight in this shorter version. So I don't know, maybe if they release the longer one, they'll have more of my interview in that because it was a whole day affair.
Right. A lot of work, isn't it? Why was it so important that they release it before the election? What's this connection between Christian nationalism, dominion theology, biblical patriarchy? How does that all come together in this election?
I think probably all of us have our own personal takes on that. I think Kristen especially has been very much pro-democracy and wants to highlight the way that Trump and Project 2025 is going to degrade our democracy. And I think we all came together with this understanding that the way we have gotten to a place with Trump, supported by so many evangelicals, is understanding that they are okay with the way Trump has lived his life. They have supported and enabled abusers for decades. The stories that are highlighted in the documentary are in the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S. And it makes sense that if they are supporting and propping up sexual abusers in church, why wouldn't they vote for one for president? And so I think the film is trying to make that connection between how evangelicals are thinking, why they are voting this way, why the many instances of evidence against Trump as a sexual predator has made zero difference in how they vote. So I think it's a really important thing to come out with. It feels really fraught here right now.
It's certainly polarized. I mean, here in the UK, I have all my British friends asking me what in the hell is going on over there in America. I try to explain it as best I can to the British people that I'm around all day long, and it's hard to explain it. But my answer is kind of what you said. It's this deeply polarized nation. You can't even talk to people on sort of like the other sides of the divide. I was watching the other day, there was a BBC show on, I think it's called the Question Show or something like that. And they were actually in Philadelphia talking to Trump supporters, Harris supporters, and undecided people is like a town hall meeting, and the people that were, it was again deeply polarized audience, and someone said, I support Trump, and here's my reason why, and someone else would completely disagree with them, and it turned into this big argument. And it's yeah, I know what you mean. It's very it's very deeply polarized nation, isn't it?
Yeah, and, currently there's a battle of the signs in my neighborhood. I'm not sure if they put up a lot of political signs in the UK, but here in
Oh,
West
they don't.
Michigan here in West Michigan, everybody has a political sign. We've got our Harris sign out front, and then our neighbors across the street keep putting out more and more Trump signs, so I'm not sure how this is gonna end, but
Mm,
it's
yeah.
stressful because, it's not just a joke, it makes me uncomfortable being a woman and realizing so many of my neighbors are voting for somebody and the a vice president also who have been speaking so much misogyny in their rhetoric and among other things, but just being a woman in this environment is not fun.
It's true, and that's something that you highlighted already, talking about the documentary, the connection between this biblical patriarchy, the Christian nationalism piece. These guys wanna run the country like they've been running their denominations. I can't remember who exactly said it. It might have been Kristen Dumais who said that. One of the people on the documentary said that, "Do I wanna live in a Christian nation? No. All you have to do is look at the Southern Baptist Convention for one example how these men have run this denomination and how they've silenced victims. They have shoved these things under the rug and they blame the women. That's what comes across, isn't it? Time and time again, not only is the woman, the victim, not believed, she is blamed if she's assaulted by a church leader. I mean, what's that dynamic? What's that about? How do they get away with that?
I wish I was surprised. I think when you have lived through so much of that church culture, it's not a surprise because, well, first off, the theology in a lot of these churches is that women should submit, men are supposed to be the leaders and the aggressors. And there's this idea that women are temptresses, and anytime a man sins, it's the woman who failed in some way to prevent that from happening. And that's just built into the system. It's built into the theology. It's built into how people talk about it. Most of these churches don't have any women in leadership. So there's no like accountability for how women are treated. And at the same time, they're being taught this is what God wants you to do. And so women are being coerced into that kind of situation.
I think it was Rachel Den Hollander, she said something to that effect that in this theological system, this patriarchal system, men are the warriors. They're the ones out front. They're the godly men. And women, if they're not submissive, then they're seen as temptresses to lead a godly man astray. So it's a double whammy, isn't it? Not only are they're like programmed to have sex and, procreate and be the big strong warriors and the Mark Driscolls of the world, you know? What was that one? There was a men's conference, I don't know, maybe 6, 8 months ago
Yeah.
where guys coming out with a tank and crushing cars and shooting guns and a male stripper and Mark Driscoll got,
That's
got
insane.
involved. It's just madness. I mean,
What
what
was that?
the hell? Yeah, what is going on? And yeah, obviously, Kristen Dumais, she talks about that in her book that it's this muscular, masculine Christianity. What's the role of women in that? Just to have babies and procreate. What's the end game here?
I think all the work you've done in exposing dominionism and Christian nationalism, I think you've been able to show like there is really a plan here. It's not just random people wanting to get into office. There's this whole network of conservatives, Christian nationalists who are trying to gain power in the country. We see that in the Heritage Foundation with their Project 2025. And they have this, huge plan of how to make this a Christian country. I mean, for me, I think a lot of people are surprised by that. For me and for you, I'm sure, like we grew up in a world where this was common things to talk about. I grew up listening to R.J. Rushdoony, the father of dominionism, or whatever you want to call him,
Yeah.
for history.
Reconstructionism.
Yeah, for history class. That was my history class. And it's just wild to think that we used to be called the fringe, like we were the exceptions to the Christian religion. At least that's how I felt like we were treated. And then more and more, this fringe has become mainstream. And these fringe pastors and leaders are becoming more powerful and more influential, especially with the rise of the internet and social media. So I don't know. I feel very concerned about them gaining more power because I know what it's like to live in a world run by these kinds of men.
Well, what's the connection between the dominion theology piece and the homeschooling? Because obviously Rushdoony was a big factor in that. Something that Tia Leving said, she said something to the effect that these Christian biblical patriarchalists, they run their family the way they want to run the country. The penny kind of dropped when I heard her say that. I was like, wow, that's a profound statement. Would you resonate with that? I mean, what your experience, you were a part of the stay-at-home daughters movement and you were homeschooled too, I think. So how did that all come together in your sort of experience?
Yeah, because like the whole theology is a very it's everything in your life needs to be influenced by it. That's what we're taught. What is the Christ Church, Doug Wilson's church motto, like all of Christ for all of life?
Hmm.
Like that's what they believe. They believe that your faith, your religion needs to be every single part of your life, and that includes your family and it also includes the way your government should work. So yeah, I think they believe that I think in their heads, most of them believe that the world would be a better place if it had a Christian government.
For
But they
everyone,
don't
yeah, even for
seem,
non-Christians, that
yeah,
yeah, the rising tide lifts all boats sort of argument.
right. And so I think some of them have that belief or that excuse. I don't think the top leaders believe that. I think they want power. But I think a lot of like regular people in this movement might believe that. And what they're missing is those other pieces of like how other people will be affected by this. I don't know. Maybe you listen to there's this podcast called Extremely American
Haven't
from
heard of it.
NPR. You should listen to it. The whole second season is about Doug Wilson,
Oh, really?
and they actually got to interview him. And for some reason, he agreed to interview, and they interviewed a bunch of people at this church. So I highly recommend listening to that. At one point, the interviewer asks, I'm Jewish. Would I be allowed to have power or influence or leadership position in this kind of world? And it wasn't Doug Wilson, it was another person in that area who said no. And he was just like so friendly about it. Like, no, you
Yeah.
wouldn't. And it's just like to his face, you know,
So matter
they,
of fact.
yeah. And it's so, I don't know. I have a hard time grappling with people's sense of empathy. At the same time, you know, we're hearing so many people say empathy is bad now, at least from those circles. So it's a struggle to know why they are okay with hurting so many people.
Thing is, I remember reading articles about women, like the Sarah Stankerb article. I don't know if you read that in Vice, talking about women in Doug Wilson's church who were, their cases of marital rape and things like that. I mean, this is the legacy of a guy like Wilson. What's your take on Wilson now? Were you raised with his stuff as well as like R.J. Rushdoony and all the other people?
Oh yeah, my dad would go out to Moscow for conferences and
Mm.
the church we were going to in Maryland at the time started a classical school based on Wilson's model. And yeah, so he was a big influence in my early childhood. And it's really frustrating that he's still out saying the same old things.
That he is. He's yeah, bigger than ever. And we were saying before we hit record that the sort of shocking thing is he's been mainstream platformed by so many big evangelical leaders, John
Mm.
Piper and so many others who apparently have no problem with the more problematic stuff that Wilson says. Maybe they agree with it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
They agree with that core part about women and how men should be in charge of women,
Mm.
at the very least. And, you know, he's even been platformed by Tucker Carlson this
Yeah.
past year. And so we see this line of Christian nationalism really coming very clear now. I think for a while, I think he was kind of vague about that, but he's becoming more and more clear about what he wants.
Well, and of course, Canon Press, which is his sort of publishing house. He doesn't own it, but he started it, I guess.
Yeah.
They published the book The Case for Christian Nationalism by Stephen Wolfe. So,
Mm.
he's pushing this stuff. He's been on podcasts, he's been on shows, he's had people on his show. So yeah, they all seem to run in the same circles, don't they? Because I see things. I follow the Examining Doug Wilson, and I don't know if you follow those people.
Yeah.
They do amazing work. I've partnered with them on a lot of the stuff I did on Doug Wilson, and they'll put things on Facebook about, I can't believe it. Doug Wilson's being asked to speak at a major conference, Christian conference or homeschooling conference, and they're like, come on, really? Why are you platforming this guy? What's the deal?
Yeah. And it's like at some point, you have to believe what they're saying, right? Like,
Mm.
but like with Trump supporters, I mean, I think some people vote for the party, but some people vote because they like Trump. And I think we should take them at their word. Like, that's what they want.
He's saying the things out loud that we wish we could say. And all that kind of stuff. I recently went through Jeff Charlotte's book, The Undertow. I don't know if you've read that, but it's a fascinating book. He basically he goes on a cross country drive, and he's trying to find out about Ashley Babbitt, who was the woman that was shot at the Capitol January 6th insurrection. And all along the way, he meets some really interesting people that are Trump supporters, and man, the conspiracy theories and all that. And they're totally, totally in 100%. I
Yeah.
mean, there is no coming back for these people, and that's probably your neighbors, or who knows, some of them are fully invested in the cult of Trump, and you can't any and that's why you going back to what you said before. I mean, these are your neighbors, these are the people in your community. What does that do to your sort of relationship with your neighbors, the people that live right next door or right across the street from you?
Yeah, I mean, like, I always want to have an attitude of openness and compassion. This is the first year I've ever put a political sign out because I've been hesitant to draw that kind of line. This year feels especially important to me, and that's why I wanted to do it. But I do believe we need to build bridges and build a country where we have multiple parties, because I think that's important. I think it's important that we have multiple perspectives working together to solve problems in our country. It's become this point where this party has become like a cult, like you said, and people just don't seem to be willing to listen to others' perspectives. And especially when it comes to taking away people's rights, especially women's rights, trans people's rights. We have a lot of book banning in my area of the country. Just like this cracking down of democracy and what I value and what I think a lot of Americans value. It's really disturbing to know that maybe my neighbors believe that, you know? And I just can't. It's hard for me too, like on a personal level. Some of my neighbors have little kids, right? And so you have the name of a sexual predator on your yard when your little girls are running around. And I just can't fathom it. Like I have a hard time understanding why.
Well, it goes back to the name of that documentary, For Our Daughters. I've got 2 daughters, and I think the same thing, like, okay, what kind of a person do I wanna be for them? And these things are so important that what we're doing, how does that relate to, like you say, they're voting this guy? Of course, they don't believe he was not convicted. It was all a sham, a witch hunt. None of it's true. They believe everything he says, hook, line, and sinker, total gaslighting. Course, he's not a sexual predator in their view. He isn't. He isn't a fraudulent businessman, and he isn't this, and he never paid off Stormy Daniels, and on and on and on. He never had that affair. He never did anything with E. Jean Carroll. So they don't believe he's any sort of a bad person, do they? He's trustworthy. In fact, that was one of the questions on that BBC question show. How important is a candidate's character? And I thought, here we go. We're going to torpedo Trump. And this Trump supporters were like, he loves America. He's the greatest man that's ever, come along. He's our savior. And I'm like, what? What Kool-Aid are you people drinking?
Yeah. And I guess, when you see this so much in the church too, of just people thinking women are lying all the time, like how many women need to come forward for you to believe them?
How many comes across in the documentary? Women are shamed and blamed and silenced, and it's classic Darvo tactics, all these things. Well, I was thinking, going back to your book, you talked about in the documentary, a lot of the victim stories came out, Jewel Woodson and some of the other people that were literally sexually abused and assaulted by
Yeah.
clergy. But yet in your book, you say you realize you were sort of unwittingly the victim of abuse in your home environment. Can you talk us through that? Because you may not have been sexually abused by a clergyman. I don't know, maybe you were, but what is that dynamic? How did you start to realize, wait a minute, I am being abused on some level?
Yeah, because I was growing up in this world, so it didn't feel like a shock to my system, right? It was just like from birth, growing up
Yeah.
in a very authoritarian home. My dad has that kind of personality. I'm not going to diagnose him, but Trump reminds me of him, right? Like the way he treats people and talks about people. And that was my home environment. And then my church environment became more and more into Christian patriarchy and this whole stay-at-home daughter thing. And women shouldn't go to college or get jobs. That was my growing up world. And so I understand now that I was always in an unsafe environment, and I couldn't recognize it as abuse because I wasn't taught what that was. I wasn't taught about consent. I wasn't taught about my body or that it belonged to me. So I had those impacts like purity culture for sure, the detachment and the disembodiment that from childhood. And then it wasn't until my 20s when I'm being told I need to stay home until I get married, that I won't be an adult until I get married, which is not true. It started to hit me how little choice I had in my life. And right around my early 20s, I finally got access to a computer. I didn't look at first about abuse, but over time I was like, I just feel like something's wrong. Like my dad's saying this and I'm supposed to be doing this, but why do I feel so terrible all the time? And I remember reading this article about emotional abuse and psychological abuse and the impacts of that. And I just felt like I could check all of the boxes. And it was heartbreaking. Like I just had only thought abuse meant having visible signs of
Mm.
physical abuse. And I had been spanked as a child, so that's part of my story too, but like that was also rationalized. So it wasn't until my 20s that I put a name to it, and that started me thinking about how to leave and start a different life. And at this time, I printed out that article. I highlighted what I thought was the relevant points, and I gave it to my dad,
Uh,
which is not the wisest thing to do in that situation. But I was so naive, and I just believed like if he can see this, maybe he can change. Maybe
You'll see the
we can,
light.
yeah. But no, it just escalated things further, and it made it really hard to be at home.
Where was he getting his doctrine and theology from? Guys like Doug Wilson, Rushdoony? Who else was he subscribing to?
We had Patriarch magazine, which, it just literally called Patriarch
That's it right
magazine.
there on the label.
Uh, that was run by John Thompson, or no, Phil Lancaster. And John Thompson wrote about courtship for that. That's where we got our courtship ideas from John Thompson. And then Vision Forum started in the late 90s, run by Doug Phillips. And that was a big influence on our homeschooling world, too. I see us being part of Vision Forum as this big shift towards the stay-at-home daughter movement, where before maybe we would have had restrictive dating, but after that it was like, no, you're going to be going through courtship and you're not going to leave the house until you're married.
What's the theology behind it? Because I think we touched on this when we talked before, but I was under the impression that the model is sort of the umbrella of authority. As a young girl is under the authority of her father, and then that's shifted to her husband. And is that kind of the way it works? It's supposed to be the succession. Then she submits to her husband, and everything
Yeah.
just carries on. Is that how it would be seen from your view?
Yeah, exactly. It was just kind of Doug Phillips, the head of Vision Forum, was mentored and influenced by Bill Gothard of IBLP. So it makes sense that that theology just kind of transferred over to this newer organization.
Exactly. And this is something I talk about a lot in my book, the Bill Gothard umbrellas of authority. Yeah, I'm very familiar with that because I can remember my mom taking me aside when I was probably 10 and explaining to me why my older sister Valerie had gotten pregnant and ruined her life and everyone else's lives and destroyed our family and blah, 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 because she had removed herself out from underneath her umbrella of authority. And therefore, she was then fair game to Satan and all that. So there's nothing we can do. And at the time, 9, 10, 11-year-old kid, I'm thinking, yeah, this makes perfect sense. Like you said, it was completely normalized. It all made sense. Is that the theology you were raised with as well?
Yeah, and there's no outside information, so you don't really understand that there's different ways of thinking. You have this vague sense that you're different from your neighbors, but that you don't really understand how different you are because you're just taught what you're taught from your parents and you trust that. But yeah, the authority I don't remember using that image, the umbrella of authority, because we weren't part of Bill Gothard's organization, but that idea of authority and meant like husband over wife over children was how our family was run. And I always think of it as like, the dad's like the mini cult leader of the family.
It's a family cult, and that's the weird thing about the IBLP thing. When I was a kid, I never met Bill Gothard. He wasn't in our house, but yet every family that followed his teaching basically became a mini cult in a weird way. Because, like you say, the father becomes this weird quasi cult leader in his home. totally, overseeing everything. I mean, some are more controlling than others. We will be right back in just a few minutes in the second half of this conversation with returning guest Cait West, talking more about her book, Rift, How She Escaped from the World of Christian Patriarchy. And I'm going to play a couple of clips for Cait. One's from Joel Webbon, the other is from Doug Wilson. And of course, these guys are diehard biblical patriarchalists, guys that I've talked a lot about on this show before. Certainly Doug Wilson, not so much about Joel Webbon, but this guy is gaining more traction online. And hearing from a person like Cait is super important, especially right now, as we've seen Donald Trump has just won the American presidential election. What's in store? Is it going to be 4 years of The Handmaid's Tale? Who knows? But we need perspectives like Cait because, as I've said in the podcast, the issue is not just that these biblical patriarchalists, these dominionists, these Christian nationalists want to run the government like they run their denominations. We've seen that in the Southern Baptist Church, but also the way they run their families or the way they want to run their families. So if you want a preview of what their theocracy looks like, look no further than their families and how they control. And there's a lot of abuse that goes on in those situations. So it's really important to hear voices like Cait and others. In fact, if you haven't seen that documentary For Our Daughters, I'll put the link for that in the show notes. That's a really important documentary, certainly talking about clergy abuse and how these women were treated shockingly badly when they just tried to come forward to tell their story about how they were abused by clergy members. And of course, in so many cases, these preachers, these pastors were quickly, quote unquote, restored back to their former positions. I mean, it's just shocking. And as Cait points out, this is what's paved the way for a guy like Donald Trump. And of course, why so many evangelicals not only voted for him the first time around, the second time around, now again, have reelected him. So we will see what the next 4 years has in store. All right, what's coming up here in the next few episodes on the Dismantling Doctrine podcast? We've got a conversation with Lauren Axelrod. Really interesting, fascinating conversation, kind of going back to this theme of spirituality that I talked about with Larry Jordan a while back. She's into interspirituality. So what can all the religions of the world teach us? Is there something there? Kind of, again, echoing what Larry Jordan's working on, but she takes it in a different direction. I had such a fascinating conversation with Lauren. In fact, once I stopped recording, we stayed on the call for another 30 or 40 minutes just chatting about spirituality and how that can be very triggering for people like me who come out of controlling religion. So this is a fascinating one with Lauren, and hopefully she'll be back in the month of January, maybe February, for our Dismantling Doctrine podcast Zoom call. These are a great chance for you to meet returning guests of the show. We just had one this Sunday, the 24th, with Karen Unruh. That episode just came out. She's the author of the book, The Blue Jellyfish Syndrome. So it's a good chance to meet people. And if you want to be a part of that, you can join the Patreon community. As always, the links to that are in the show notes. And the other thing is I had a good conversation the other day, finally touching base with my very, very good friends, Conway and Siegelman, authors of Snapping and Holy Terror. They've been doing a ton of work for the last couple of years on what they're calling the Holy Terror Classic Edition. Conway and Siegelman were the first, really, to document the rise and the spread of the early Christian right, coming off the back of a major study of cults in America back in the late 1970s. And then they noticed that there were a lot of eerie parallels between the worlds of the cults that they'd been studying and the early rise of the Christian right, certainly what was going on with the mass movement followers. So these guys have done some amazing work and are still working on this. So look for that episode with Conway and Siegelman coming up after the one with Lauren Axelrod. Really good stuff coming up, and I'm working on some other interviews in the pipeline, so I'll keep you appraised of that. And then finally, my book is still selling on Amazon. If you haven't had a chance to read it yet, it is called Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, How Bill Gothard, Church and Family Taught Me Christianity Doesn't Work. It's available as a paperback, as a Kindle ebook version. And the cool thing is if you buy the Kindle version for just a little bit more, you can get the AI-produced virtual voice audio version, which is surprisingly good considering it was read by a computer program. Basically, I would like to do my own audio version of the book at some point. I just don't have the time right now with work, but that is hopefully in the pipeline. Maybe next year I'll be able to sit down and actually record the book and release it as my own audible version. One last thing too, if you do pick up a copy of the book on Amazon, please do me a favor and leave me a review, which helps greatly with the book's rankings. Okay, let's get on back into the second half of this conversation with Cait West as we continue looking at this issue of rift breaking away from Christian patriarchy. Later, I'll play this clip by Joel Webbon. This guy, he's taking it to a whole new level, talking
Yeah.
about there are 4 people in my family. I tell them when they can go to the bathroom and what they're going to wear, his wife and 3 children. I mean, my dad never did
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. Was that your experience? Was that as extreme as Joel Webbon?
Yeah, I mean, my pastor was Kevin Swanson, and he sounds a lot like him. Kevin Swanson is still has his radio show. He has his own homeschooling curriculum now. He's been on the news, I always think, fire and brimstone type of preaching, but it's always about how evil our country is and we need to make it Christian again. And this is why we have hurricanes. And he would say just shocking statements like that about the bathroom. Not that specifically, but I listened back to his old sermons to write my book. And it was hard because he was saying things like, as an adult, I'm like, this is not okay. He was saying from the pulpit, you can hurt your children and it's okay if there are bruises because bruises heal. And he said that from the pulpit. And I was just like, all of those adults in that room didn't say anything about that. They didn't say that's not okay. They actually just obeyed him. And that's what happened. I saw the bruises. It just makes me so angry. Like, they are so straightforward with these ideas and people follow them. And that's why I get so upset about it. People like Joel Webbon is like the same kind of stuff.
Same kind of stuff. Yeah, he's controlling his family. He's like the mini cult leader. But yeah, he's turning around and saying women shouldn't be allowed to vote. What's your take as a woman when you hear Joe Webbon say things like that?
Yeah, I mean, the world I grew up in, women, we were told it was a bad choice for women to have the vote, and women in the Christian patriarchy movement and in our church, they were supposed to vote for whoever their husbands told them to. My dad would write out on a piece of paper for my mom to take to the ballot box. This is who you vote for. Now I understand that that's coercion and that's illegal. You're not supposed to intimidate or threaten or coerce people into voting. I've been talking about that today actually online because so many women are in these relationships where they feel afraid to vote their conscience. They have to vote for whoever they're being told to vote for. It's like that household voting that Joel Webbon and Doug Wilson want. It negates women's voices.
The head of household thing, that's part of the Christchurch culture. Do you know anything about the HOH, the head of household? How does that work exactly? Is that how it is where the man tells the woman, my vote, this is how you're gonna vote?
That's how it works practically because currently we have a system where women do have the right to vote. In our church, we were part of a Presbyterian denomination that allowed women to vote, but in our specific church, they would give the votes to the head of household, which is usually the father, and he could choose to write down the votes or I suppose pass them on to his wife, unless you were like a single woman or a widow, and then you were the head of your household, and then you could have your vote. So they ran it that way in our church, and that's what they would want for the country. They would want the head of the household to have the single vote. Or I guess, as J.D. Vance likes to talk about, if you have more children, you have more of a vote, which is confusing.
Yeah, it's a quiverful movement. Well, while we're on the subject, I'll go ahead and play this clip.
Okay.
Okay, here's Joel Webbon talking, and I'm interested to hear your take on his theology behind why he explained women shouldn't be allowed to vote. This is courtesy of our good friends over at the Right Wing Watch.
If we had a Christian nation and women could vote, then within 50 years, we would no longer have a Christian nation. God has not designed women for warfare. And that's part of what politics is. It's really all that politics is. It's war without the blood. It's two disagreeing parties. You go and rally your troops, everybody who agrees with you. I'll go and rally mine. And then we'll come to the battlefield. And right before the bullets start to fly, we'll stop. And instead of fighting, we'll count. And whoever has the bigger army, they win. And the other army has to surrender and go with their decision. But then everybody gets to go home and live. But that's what politics is. It is war. And I believe that the sword has been given to men the sword is, without being crude, I think this is a fact. It is a phallus. It is assigned by God to men. I think nature shows that. I think scripture shows that. So both natural revelation and special revelation. War is something that is belonging to men, and it's not something that we employ in our ranks, whether it be political war or whether it be literal war, women and children. So in the same way, and people are like, that's so archaic. You're a Neanderthal. You're so, primitive and chauvinistic. You won't let women vote. Well, our society doesn't let 5-year-olds vote yet. I pray that it, that it stays that way. But we don't let children. We don't let children vote, and it's not just because of competency, because that would be the immediate counter as well. But their brain isn't fully developed, and so are you saying that a woman is like a child? Yes. But not intellectually. I'm not saying that. The question is how. In what way is a woman like a child? She is like a child in the way that God has appointed men to protect them. Women are not supposed to be leading the way. They're to be protected.
Okay.
Wow.
What's your take on, there's a lot in there, isn't there, Cait?
Ooh, yeah, that is
Wow. Not offensive at all.
no, not at all. No, he sounds deranged.
He really does, yeah. And yeah, he's calmly, advocating his position on some podcast or some show on YouTube and being totally respected and accepted for it.
I mean, I hate to keep using this cliche, but it's like The Handmaid's Tale. Everyone keeps saying that, but it literally is what they want. This oppressive society for women, and because they're children, because they can't protect themselves, they can't speak for themselves. That's very upsetting. And then his idea about politics being war, I think, says a lot about why they want the country to be run this way. They don't even see politics as governance or like as a way to compromise with many people. They are against plurality. So that's disturbing. That's
Really?
That's a dictatorship.
Well, and then he goes into this really disturbing thing about men are given the sword. That's biblical. And somehow it's a phallus-shaped symbol.
Yeah. Okay.
What? I mean, what
I
is...
think we should get Freud to like dissect this guy.
Yeah, and I mean, as a woman, what is your take on that, where he says women, they're not like children intellectually, so you're not stupid, Cait. So take some, there's some good in there. You're just, you can't protect yourself. And
Yeah.
men are supposed to protect you, so, that's why you shouldn't be allowed to vote.
Yeah, that's benevolent patriarchy, because you're being told, this is protecting you. This is for your own good. You don't know what's good for you. I know what's good for you. So you just be quiet and sit still, and I'll take care of it. That's benevolent patriarchy, and it's a ruse.
Well, now on to Doug Wilson. I'll play this the part of this clip was played in the documentary, but I'm interested to hear your take on this. Just a couple of seconds long.
Godly women want to feed their men. Godly women are designed to make the sandwiches. This is not an absolute law like the one about making babies, and there are times when a man fends for himself and makes quite a decent sandwich. But in the general scheme of things, the Apostle Paul wants the women to make the sandwiches.
That's from Doug Wilson's blog and Mablog. God wants women to make the sandwiches. What do you think about that, Cait? Do you want to make your husband or whoever a sandwich, and that's your role?
I mean, like,
God designed it.
who cares about sandwiches? Like, anybody can make anyone a sandwich. But I think what he's really saying is, women, your position is serving your husband. It's in the kitchen. It's in the house. That's your role. And don't you dare step out of that space. That's what it sounds like to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because he talks about elsewhere that the world has been created by God's design. And according to his worldview, that is a patriarchal system. So as a woman, you fit into that system. You must be submissive to whatever man or male authorities above you, husband, pastor, I guess, president, whoever, government, whatever. And that's, he says women, if they rebel against that, they're rebelling against God's natural order. So you're in real trouble here, Cait. If you're rebelling, you're not just rebelling against Doug Wilson or Joel Webbon, you're rebelling against God himself.
Right. Which is a fear tactic. And I think when I was in it, I was so afraid of going to hell because I never could be good enough for this world, for this Christian patriarchy world and this kind of theology. I was never going to be good enough. And so that's what keeps you under control, right? Is like the fear of, if I don't do this, then I might go to hell. I mean, it's the same thing with the voting. I'm just reminded of Someone shared with me she didn't vote in the last presidential election because her husband said, if you don't vote this certain way, I will sabotage your car so you get in an accident.
Good
Like,
Lord.
this is what's happening in these relationships. And that's just declared as biblical or godly or whatever they want to call it, because the man is supposed to have the say in everything.
But now there's another issue here. We haven't mentioned this. Now, Doug Wilson says this is by design. This is what the Apostle Paul teaches in the New Testament. What's your take on that? Because Doug Wilson, Joe Webbon, all these guys, these Christian biblical patriarchalists, they're only parroting what Paul actually teaches in the New Testament. What's your take on that? Because that's the real issue here. Paul says women must submit to men. Women should not be allowed to speak in churches. I was looking at another video that Joel Webbon did, why women should not ever be allowed to preach or have authority in a church. That's all based on biblical precedent. What's your take on that now?
I think there's a lot to debate there. There's a lot to dig in if you really want to get into like theology and what Paul was saying, or whoever was writing certain letters in the New Testament was trying to say. That passage about women submitting to men, or wives submitting to husbands, it also says husbands submit to your wives. And they like to leave that little part out.
Yeah,
right?
never talk about that.
No,
Submit to one another, it says, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Submit to one another. They always leave that out. And so they set it up as a hierarchy. So it can be debated whether that's what's truly intended. I think Beth Allison Barr has done a lot of work in tracking how patriarchy has infiltrated the Christian church. And it hasn't always been this way. And I think that's an interesting way to go if you want to explore more of that. I'm interested in the historical parts of it. I don't personally have a stake in the church anymore, but I do want women to have a voice.
Sure, absolutely. And I love that fact about the documentary. That clearly comes across, especially some of the women who, were, vilified, ripped to shreds by the people in the Southern Baptist Convention, people online, when they were just trying to speak out. But one little thing about the documentary that kind of struck me at the end, it's kind of like we're trying to make Christianity palatable. If we really follow Jesus, then this wouldn't be happening. What's your take on that? Because you said you don't have a stake in the church anymore. Are you trying to reform the church and make it, true Christ-like environment? Where are you at now with your faith?
No, I'm very much agnostic. So I have no desire to reform the church. What I care about is making any community safer. And my background is in churches. And so it's a big passion of mine to help people who go to church make them safer for people in terms of abuse. And I was always clear about that with Kristen when she was interviewing me. I was like, is it okay if I'm agnostic and I'm in your film? Because she's a Christian, and I knew that, that impacts her perspective. And she was like, I just want you to tell your story and be honest. And so I felt really safe doing that. And I think they put those quotes from, there was a pastor and then Rachel Denhollander about following Christ. And I think the beauty about a documentary is you can have multiple voices and then people can take what applies to them from it. And Kristen's always been open about that as well. She debated stopping the documentary where Krista says, the quote you mentioned about if they make the country like the church, it'll be bloody awful. She debated just stopping it right there, but they wanted to give people some kind of hope, some kind of way forward. And I think the target audience will be a lot of evangelicals. And so I'm hopeful that it reaches them because of that. And I feel free to just say, I'm not a part of church. I'm not saying you need to be part of church to heal from abuse, but I think we could come together on that common ground of wanting this to stop.
And I think, it just hits me again, watching those pastors get standing ovations. It's so powerful. And you think, my God, Andy Savage, because I followed that story. I think I wrote an article or two about it on Medium when the story broke a few years back. And it's so shocking to think, they're giving these guys standing ovations and they're so quick to restore them. And that's the state of the church, these mega churches, these mega church pastors. So yeah, that's the way it is in so many of these places. I'm glad we got out. We escaped. You escaped. I escaped for different reasons, maybe. It's true.
Yeah. Life is so much freer without that feeling of just constant control, constant needing to conform, or you're going to be cut off. When you get to make that choice to not be a part of it, it takes your power back a little bit instead of just being excommunicated. I don't know. At least for me, that's where I'm at. It feels safer to not be in a church.
It's ironic, yeah, because I was just telling my girlfriend the other day how many shocking stories I could tell when I was a pastor of a church about how shabbily and poorly Christians treated each other, terrible things that happened in our church and obviously other churches as well, and she's like, "I don't wanna hear it, you're not religious." I said, "Yeah, but the thing is that this is what Christianity promised, this is what religion promised us, was a loving, safe place, and it's so far from that." Luckily, we didn't have that I know of, we didn't have any sexual abuse in our church, but we had all kinds of emotional, spiritual abuse, and I tried to confront it as a pastor. It's so difficult. These people are so entrenched in this system, and man, trying to get through to them, it's just next to impossible. Then they'd leave the church. They'd say, "You're being controlling. You're trying you're trying to silence me. We're leaving this church. We're going to find another church."
Right.
Okay, good riddance. I mean, I say, thank God I'm ironically not part of that anymore. Remind us again, what's the name of your book, and how can people find it and find you on social media?
Yeah, my book is called Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy. It's available probably anywhere you get your books. I'm sure it's available in the UK as well. There's a hardcover, there's an ebook, and I also read for the audiobook. So whatever format people like, that's available. You can follow me on my website and see upcoming events if you're in the US. I would love to do UK events. If anyone wants to invite me, I would love to go back. And I also have a Substack, caitwest.substack.com, and that's where you would get the most direct updates in your email.
All right, so some good resources. Yeah, if you ever do come over to the UK, come up to North Wales, we'll do a pub crawl, and we can put the world to rights over a couple of good, pints, and
Sounds great.
I'll show you all around Wrexham. Have you watched the documentary Welcome to Wrexham on
I
Disney
haven't.
Plus? Yeah, it's really interesting because I live about 10 minutes from where all that's happening.
Okay.
Rob McElhaney, Ryan Reynolds, bought the football and
Wow.
soccer team,
Yeah.
and it's just blowing up over here. So it's really cool. We've gone to some of the games recently, and it's just cool. Atmosphere, great environment. So yeah, we can take you to a Wrexham game. We can hook you up.
Yeah. I love that.
So, yeah,
That'd be
thank you
great.
so much, Cait. Really good to touch base again. I'm glad you've gotten your book out. I'm glad you were part of the documentary. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.